After a trilateral meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and after the fall of Bashar al-Assad's dictatorship in Syria, US President-elect Donald Trump addressed Putin with a proposal to start negotiations and end Russia's war against Ukraine. Donald Trump emphasized that after the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime, Russia and Iran are in a weakened state. Russia because of Ukraine and its poor economy, and Iran because of Israel and its military success. However, in the same text, Donald Trump notes that Zelenskyy and Ukraine would like to make a deal and stop the madness. He emphasized that Ukraine had senselessly lost 400,000 soldiers and many more civilians. Trump estimates Russian casualties at 600,000 Russian soldiers who are wounded or dead. Trump emphasizes the need for an immediate ceasefire and negotiations. Too many lives have been lost senselessly, too many families have been destroyed, and if this continues, it could turn into something much bigger and much worse. I know Putin well. This is his time to act. China can help. The world is waiting. This is a statement that, of course, raises an incredible number of questions. First of all, about the world in which the President-elect of the United States continues to live, and about what might happen in this world after Donald Trump's inauguration. First, we need to focus on the number of Ukrainian victims that Donald Trump is talking about. Perhaps this number was deposited in his mind because of certain television programs or media reports that Donald Trump followed during his election campaign. But what was more confusing was the word senseless, which should, of course, be clarified. What kind of meaninglessness of Ukrainian sacrifices is Trump talking about? Were the sacrifices that led to the fact that Ukraine still remains on the political map of the world and can fight for its sovereignty, its independence, and the safety of its citizens meaningless? Were the sacrifices of the Ukrainian military, who prevented brutal atrocities throughout Ukraine, who liberated Kharkiv and Kherson regions, who are now keeping Russian troops out of the Donbas offensive, meaningless? After all, everyone is well aware of what Vladimir Putin wants to gain from this war. Not to mention that when Donald Trump talks about the senselessness of civilian casualties, he should remember that these people were victims of Russian aggression, Russian bombing of Ukraine, Russian strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure, on civilian objects, on hospitals and kindergartens. And the question arises, what does the senselessness of these victims mean? Should all these people have simply agreed to let Russian troops enter their cities, and then there would have been fewer civilian casualties, as Donald Trump believes? But perhaps this is not what the newly elected US president meant, but that the war itself is pointless, and that Vladimir Putin started it pointlessly. Of course, this leads to senseless casualties on both sides, and if there were no war, there would be no human casualties. One could still agree with this interpretation, although, again, it is a matter of how the newly elected US president expresses his thoughts. As we understand it, it is not at all new that he often expresses them in such a contradictory way that it has to be explained to the entire White House press service. And now, there is simply no such press service, and the fact that during Donald Trump's first presidency, his associates tried to advise him to post less on social media is also a fact. Now there are no people who could somehow limit Donald Trump, and there never will be. So in the future, there will be many more such statements that we will have to rethink on our own. But there is another question. When Donald Trump says that Ukraine and Zelenskyy would like to make a deal, this is obviously based on the results of his meeting with the Ukrainian and French presidents. But what kind of deal does Donald Trump have in mind? A just peace, a peace based on strength, which he spoke about in Paris, or Ukraine's capitulation to Russia, which will create the possibility of absorbing the whole state, if not now, then in the near future. And when Donald Trump addresses Putin, whom he says he knows well, what is he counting on? That the Russian president will immediately say that he is ready to negotiate with Ukraine on the terms that would satisfy the American president-elect and his team and preserve their political reputation, or on the terms we are now hearing from the Russian president and his foreign minister or Russian propagandists. Conditions that actually imply the capitulation of Ukraine, and even under the pressure that otherwise the Russian Federation is ready to use its famous Oreshnik, or maybe something more, which Donald Trump hints at not only against Ukraine, but also against European countries, against countries that are allies of the United States. So is it worth going to the grand opening of Notre Dame Cathedral to create a risk that this Notre Dame will simply be destroyed by some Russian missile? This is, of course, a rhetorical question, but I would like to have a non-rhetorical answer to it. And here is the most important question, the question of Donald Trump's entire presidency. What will the American president do after his inauguration? He believes that Russia is weakened by the war in Ukraine and the state of its economy. There is no doubt that this is what his associates are telling him, and that the situation with the Russian economy leaves much to be desired. However, no one knows what Russia's resources are for further continuation of the war in Ukraine, and how Vladimir Putin himself assesses these resources. So, if Vladimir Putin does not pay attention to all these appeals from Donald Trump, continues the war, or offers conditions that are catastrophic for the Ukrainian people and humiliating for the United States, what will Donald Trump do in this situation? Something or nothing? This is the main question to which we will get an answer in January 2025, not immediately, of course. However, there is no doubt that with this perception of the world and this idea of Ukrainian victims, Ukraine will face very difficult times ahead. And no matter what the president-elect of the United States says, the sacrifices of Ukrainians in this war were not meaningless and were not in vain. Ukrainians will always remember their heroes, and it is not for politicians from other countries to assess whether the sacrifices of Ukrainian people were in vain or not. Here is the Ukrainian side talking about the terrible tragedy caused by a Russian missile that killed a family, while the Russian representative was amused by this story.
A Russian missile took 4 lives from one family. Evgenia Bazilevich and her 3 daughters were gone in a moment. The youngest, Emilia, was just 6. We can hardly imagine their father's sorrow. Those weren't military targets. Those were homes many kilometers far from the front lines. Ordinary people, children. Some things can no longer be changed. Russia will never be able to alter its authorship from the atrocities committed in Ukraine.
Russia does not feel sorry for the victims among the civilian population of Ukraine. The Russians do not care. Shooting and killing civilians is a humiliating step, but the Russian mafia, led by Putin, is proud of it. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it. This video was prepared by Hustler. See you soon.